Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to another episode on Boys in the Cave. This episode is sponsored by Human Appeal Australia. So if you plan on giving a sadaqah or zakat, consider Human Appeal. Human Appeal Australia are helping Palestinians by actively providing displaced families with freshly cooked hot meals as well as vegetable baskets sourced from their Human Appeal farm and local suppliers. They're also providing clean water for drinking and sanitation for those in need, inshallah. So all the links will be in the show notes. So we're here with a very, very special guest. Shaykh Dr Asim Yusuf is a senior scholar, Sufi master, and expert in the philosophy of Islamic psychology. He's the emeritus chair of the British Board of Scholars and Imams and fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I always get that wrong, but he's currently teaching and writing a commentary on the Ihya, Ulum, deen of Imam Ghazali. His work can be found on nurulhabib.org, which we'll put in the show notes, inshallah. So thank you for your time, Sheikh. Welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu to you and to all your listeners. It's lovely to be back again.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah, it's been some time, and I know we talked a lot more about fiqh and modernity in that conversation. So today we'll probably, we did touch on spirituality and stuff back then too, but inshallah we'll get into more of that because what's interesting is that you're writing a translation of the Ihya. So I might actually start off there, because I'm sure there was a reason as to why you started writing a commentary on the Ihya. So what spiritual needs did you want to address in today's context?
Well, that's a really good idea. So it's actually a fairly recent decision. I have been teaching the Ihya Ulumuddin for over 10 years now. So we started in 2014 with a sort of an introductory semester on Ghazali himself, and then started going through the Ihya. And I haven't even reached the halfway point yet. And really, I suppose the purpose of the written commentary, such that it is, if you can call it a commentary, I don't know yet if it's going to be a commentary, but it is to really try to capture the essence of some of the lessons that we've taught, because we get into very interesting discussions actually. And one of those discussions, as you mentioned, is how to actually contextualize the Ihya to our own time. It was written, 900 years ago now. That's a long time. And many, many things have changed, of course. And I think that I took the decision to do so, probably quite foolishly, because it was my 50th Islamic birthday, and we were in Medina, and I had started teaching the Ihya unknowingly. I hadn't actually realized, but I actually started teaching the Ihya on my 40th Islamic birthday. And I realized that actually a lot of these, I have been, and I'm sure some of my students will say the same thing, but we have been transformed through our study of the Ihya, such that it is thus far. And it's going through page by page, line by line. So I'm not kind of skimming over. I'm not giving a summary. I'm just going full force into it. And there's been a lot of discussions about metaphysics, about the nature of the human, the nature of the divine, the nature of the cosmos, and the nature of the acts of worship in the religion in the first quarter of the Ihya, and so forth. So there's been a lot of very, very interesting discussions that have been kind of taken into consideration: metaphysics, psychology, but also sociology, anthropology, the nature of culture, and so forth. So it was really to try to actually condense down a lot of those discussions into a manageable format that people can actually, people will benefit from. Because the fact of the matter is, I've probably got now, God, we're on semester 23. The semesters are about 18 weeks each. You can do the multiplication, but it's probably about 400 to 500 hours of lessons. Now, let's be honest, no one's going to go through all of those. So if I can bring it down and sort of capture it in a book form, I think that would be really helpful. As it happens, there aren't really very many commentaries on the Ihya at all. In fact, there's only one real commentary on the Ihya, which was written by Imam Zabidi in the 12th century, which is excellent, but it's very focused on kind of the explanation, what's called the takhrij of the hadith, so where the hadith come from, and chains of transmission, and that type of thing. And it's quite obscure, and it doesn't really help us in terms of our day and age. So this is more, I think, a set of meditations on the Ihya. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. I'll give you two examples just to indicate this. The first is something that I was just looking at today. So I'm actually starting the commentary with Book 11, just because the way that the videos are laid out, it's a lot easier for me to access those videos and extract the information from the videos from Book 11 onwards than it is from books 1 to 10. I will circle back around to them, inshallah. And one of the discussions I was looking at was actually about the metaphysics of eating. And I was looking at this, and it started off with the question that a student had actually about vegetarianism, which is, how come we're not, the Prophet was so merciful, how come we're not vegetarian? How come we can kill animals? And I said, well, you're right, we can kill animals, but everyone kills something to live. We kill plants as well. Plants, in the Islamic tradition, plants have a life as well. We know this, all the various, the famous, hadiths about the wailing of the palm tree, which was a dead palm tree, actually. We know Imam Busiri, actually, in the beginning of the 5th chapter of the Burda, is جَعَتْ لِدَعْوَتِهِ الْأَشْجَارُ سَاجِدَةً تَمْشِي إِلَيْهِ عَلَى سَاقٍ بِلَا قَدَمِ, which means that trees uprooted themselves and came to him, prostrating before him with their roots, writing out this beautiful script on the ground, which is a poetic way of saying that by their very natures they were they were engaged in salawat on the Prophet ﷺ. And this is a reference to a hadith where a Bedouin comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, if you really are a prophet, then tell those trees to bear witness to it, thinking that at most there will be some kind of sound that comes through the leaves of the trees. Instead, the Prophet ﷺ beckons to the trees uproot themselves, come over to the Prophet ﷺ, prostrate before him. Then he tells them go back, and they go back and kind of reroot themselves in the ground. Now, what that indicates, it's an amazing miracle, but what it indicates, of course, is that trees also have a life. So the question was, how come Allah has created us such that we kill to live? And that question brought up a very, very interesting discussion about the metaphysics of eating. And it kind of encompasses biology and science and so forth. So you get the light from the sun that is captured in herbivorous things, green things of the earth, in the form of glucose. Those things are then eaten by herbivores. The herbivores are eaten by carnivores. We, like us, so we eat those things, and the food is then broken down within us. It's broken down, and it's broken back down to the glucose. The glucose goes into the mitochondria of the cell and splits apart. And when it splits apart in that act of respiration, that very same energy of the sun is released inside your cell in the form of what's called ATP. Now, what the believer does with that energy, and this it came from a discussion that Ghazali mentioned about one of the adab of eating, is that when you eat, you intend the strength to worship God. So what happens when you then utilize that energy to engage in worship of God, and of course the whole first half of the Ihya is about different ways of worshiping God. Some are actual ritual acts of worship, and some are in the form of how you treat other people. So if you like ibadah and khidmah, when you engage in that action, that amal salih, that righteous action, creates a metaphysical light in the form of that good deed that endures into eternity. In other words, that cycle of death and new life, which is the cycle of eating, is actually the cycle of the transformation of the light of the sun, which is the light of this world, into a light that will shine in the hereafter forever. And that's such a profound thing, and it occurs through this cycle of death, rebirth, death, rebirth, death, rebirth, that you are basically taking a thing that is glorifying God, whether it be the trees, whether it be the fruits, whether it be the crops, whether it be the animals. These are things that are engaged in an act of tasbih. يُسَبِّحُ لَهُ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. And the only justifiable reason to end that tasbih is to utilize what comes from it to engage in a higher form of tasbih. So you are effectively, by consuming and making the plants and the animals part of yourself, you are upgrading the tasbih to ibadah. right? And the temporal glorification, i.e., time-limited glorification of those things, into a glorification that lasts forever in the form of whether it's the trees of paradise, whether it's the the houses, the palaces of paradise, or whatever it happens to be. So that's a discussion that, of course, is not in the Ihya, but it came out of the teaching of the Ihya, and it's a very metaphysical discussion that really kind of puts this whole idea of vegetarianism or but just eating, makes eating a really sacred action. So that's one example of how that is something, eating, which is a book in the Ihya. Book 11 of the Ihya is the book of eating, and that it really kind of transforms it and makes it very real for people. So the next bite they take becomes really conscious that this is the transmission of light into light, or the transformation of light into light, or physical light into metaphysical light through this cycle. Another example is when we were talking about in book 12 of the Ihya, which is the book of marriage. And I kind of said when I taught it that this is Ghazali at his most 5th century, his most Persian, and his most male. As he's kind of teaching, as he's going through this work. But even then, how do you now take this and contextualize it to our time? And we had a very, very interesting discussion about the psychology of relationships. I should say rather the sociology of relationships. That if you are the intended audience of the Ihya and you've got to book 12, then you are a serious student of knowledge. You're a scholar. You are a Sufi aspirant. You are someone who's really serious about your religion. That puts you in that culture into the highest echelon of society. You are one of the elites of the society. If you are one of the elites of the society and you spent probably 10 years, 15 years studying the religion, then who are you likely to marry? Well, you are likely to marry the prettiest girl in the village. How old are you? Well, you're probably 25, 30 years old. How old is the prettiest girl in the village? Probably 15, right? And so there's already an age gap. Again, you can completely understandably, there is an age gap that exists there. And that's your first wife. In a polygamous society in the 5th century, and you are a person of repute and renown, it's likely you will have a second, maybe even a third wife. What's the age gap going to be then? You're going to be not only in your 40s or 30s or your 40s, not only highly educated, educated in a way that would be just completely outside the worldview of most people. You'll be like an Oxford professor at this point. There's no female Oxford professor. It just if women were that highly educated, it was usually because they were the daughters or the sisters of scholars, rather than they went to an academy to study. So there's very few of them. So there's already an intellectual gap there. There is an age gap that exists there. There is a social gap that exists there. The question then of why does Ghazali sometimes talk about women in an infantilizing way? It's probably not him talking about women, but him talking about wives. And it's probably because the people he was speaking to, there was a huge kind of hierarchical difference between the spouse and the scholar and their spouse. An educational gap, an age gap, and so forth. So their wives probably were a lot younger than them in all sorts of ways. How do you now transform that across to our time? And this was the interesting thing, because I said that we make an assumption that of course you would want to marry somebody of your own age. But why do you make that assumption? Why is it just assumed that the normal thing you do is marry somebody your own age? What, because you're going to grow old together? Right? No, it's because we live in mixed gender societies. We go to mixed gender schools. Therefore, our first crush is likely to be on somebody in our class or a year below us or a year above us. So it's somebody of around the same age. At that point, when you're going through your teens, and you're only going to marry in your 20s anyway, when you're going through that, you are just culturally entrained to be attracted to people around the same age as you, right? But that is just as much of a cultural thing as in Ghazali's time. Similarly, your wife now is likely to be of a very similar social class a very similar educational class because you move in certain societies, and therefore the relationship now that you are seeking with your spouse is not probably the type of relationship that a scholar in the 5th century would have been seeking with their spouse. This is not really about a meeting of minds, right? As it is in our time, it would be about a meeting of minds. So actually, one of the things I said was that actually the way to view your spouse in modern times is not, you don't derive that from book 12 of the Ihya. You actually derive it from book 15 of the Ihya, which is the book of companionship, which has a long section on your ikhwan fillah, on your brethren in God, which is a very, very special relationship. Your kind of BFF, basically, that you have, who is on the same path as you, who understands you. It's not like the dunyawi people. This is a person on the spiritual path. It's likely in our modern time that your wife is like to be that person. So being able to do that and move between the books of the Ihya and decontextualize from Ghazali's time and then recontextualize in our own time is something that I thought was extremely helpful. So it's a very long answer to a short question, isn't it? But that's the type of thing that we want to bring out. So at one level, it's these kind of metaphysical truths. At another level, it's these sociological truths and sociological variations and how we can take what is eternal in the Ihya and apply it to our own lives, which I probably should have just said at the beginning, right? Because that would have just explained the whole thing. You're very patient. Thank you.
No, that definitely gave a lot of context. So I appreciate that. So so you're talking about contextualizing, which is really interesting because my parents, for example, my mom was married when she was 18. My father was like 31. So, and not people won't know that when they meet them because my mom, mashallah, is a very strong character. But my my parents would probably relate more to Ghazali's time than now what you described, even though it's like a generation or two ago, which is
Well,
very funny.
I think that's one of the challenges that we probably have in our kind of contemporary society. I mean, I'm in the UK, and there's a lot of people from here who are sort of first, second generation, in the UK, and there's a very strong tradition among some of the Muslims here of a kind of marriage within families and that type of stuff. And I've met so many people who have said, well, basically, who I was going to marry was decided when I was like 3 years old. And I was, I remember one person told me that, all me and my siblings, we used to recite the names of our prospective spouses, like from the age of about 6 years old. We were just made to say the name of our spouse over and over again, and so forth. And, that is a cultural practice. And there are many like that. You're right. The challenge we have in our time is that we, from if you like, the historical culture that we come from, there may be one set of expectations, but from the culture in which we grow up, there is another set of expectations. And so what we want our lives to be is quite, we're not quite sure what we want our lives to be. And that creates its own tensions and difficulties. I think that then people have to try to navigate those things.
Yeah, definitely, and I think like having doing that project where it contextualizes things is super important because I think to some extent that is already happening in the general sense of within the Quran. Like people try to um, take the principles from the Quran, apply it in this day and age, and we actually talked about in probably the last episode we did, like how does fiqh look like in modernity, and we can see those changes and whatnot. But obviously here, it gives that guideline of how to really live our life as a Muslim, and the metaphysical aspect is also explained in that sense. So
Well,
that person,
one of the interesting questions is exactly that. What are the usul of decontextualization and recontextualization? Actually, as as in fiqh, there is a particular way of doing qiyas. There is a particular approach that you take. It is not a random activity. It has rules. The same thing applies. Actually, I found going through the Ihya that you can, there is a wrong way to try to recontextualize the Ihya, and there is a right way to do it. And actually, what that kind of the level below is when you, and I kind of use my hands, I said you have to first decontextualize. You have to first contextualize, then decontextualize, and then recontextualize, right? So you don't go. The problem is when you start to go from I contextualize and I recontextualize. This is what Ghazali said, but he was a man in the 5th century, and this is what I think should happen now, right? The problem is you haven't gone down to the level below, because what is the level below? And a lot of actually the teaching of the Ihya has kind of uncovered that lower, that level that lies underneath, because there's lots of times that Ghazali says, I can't go any more into this. It's very clear that he's an extremely systematic writer. Extremely. I mean, he's so systematic in his thinking. And so, but he does not excavate often, except in certain points. He doesn't excavate what his thinking is. But once you start finding those nuggets, those kind of breadcrumbs that are scattered through the Ihya. I've just done one of them recently, actually, in the book of Sama, actually, the book of kind of the musical audition, music basically, and he's just gone on an absolute deep dive into the metaphysics of music and of Sama, which is quite unusual. He's normally very disciplined. He doesn't go into it. But that really kind of helps to uncover. And it is that metaphysical level. It is what is the nature of the human in the context of the human's relationship with God. And if you recognize that ultimately there is, and I say to people sometimes that the religion is really simple. Really simple. Okay? It's to recognize that there is Allah and there is you. And there is the relationship between Allah and you, that's called rububiyyah. There is a relationship between you and Allah, that's called ubudiyyah. And that forms a heart. So Allah and you, Allah's relationship with you, your relationship with Allah. Okay? In the middle of that heart, there is an arrow. And the arrow is the arrow of shaitan. The shaitan seeking to disrupt your experience of Allah's rububiyyah, by which I mean his being your Rabb. That's what I mean by rububiyyah, his being your Rabb. Every single thing that you experience in your life, and I mean everything you experience in your life, is decreed for you, right? Why has Allah decreed that for you? Because he is your Rabb. And your Rabb is your cultivator. And I say to people that if God is the cultivator, what does that make you? Well, it makes you the thing being cultivated. He is the gardener and you are the seed. And he is growing you into something. The problem is you don't know what type of seed you are. Are you a rose seed? Are you an oak seed? Are you a grass seed? What type of seed are you? All right? Because you don't know what type of seed you are, you don't know how much water you need, how much sunlight you need, what type of soil is best for you to grow in, what type of climate you will grow in. You don't know any of these things, right? But you're looking at that person over there and saying, how come their life is okay? How come their life is so wonderful? Well, they are getting what they need for their growth, and you are getting what you need for your growth. At the end of us, I said to somebody once, look, some people are rose bushes and some people are cactuses. Some people grow in lush terrain, some people grow in deserts. Yeah, now you don't know, but both of them have thorns and both of them have benefits. You don't know what's like the person. The only thing they took away from that conversation was Sheikh said I'm a cactus. But chalo. But there is this. Now, what's happening now? Given this, if everything you experience is Allah's rububiyyah and everything you experience is part of his rahmaniyah, his being Rahman to you, right? Rahman is, he is merciful whether you like it or not, right? His decree is Rahmani. It's khair and it's shar is Rahmani, right? He's not sending the harm of his decree to punish you and the good of his decree to reward you. He's sending both to you, like the plant needs sunshine and rain, like the plant needs winter and summer. Okay? So now what happens, that arrow through the heart, Shaitan seeks to disrupt your experience of God's rububiyyah, and so disrupt your response of ubudiyyah. So the arrow, it'd be good if I could draw it, but the arrow breaks the heart. The arrow breaks the heart at 2 points. At the point of connection between you, between Allah and you, that's rububiyyah, and the point of your connection to Allah, that's ubudiyyah. And in the middle of your heart, you have Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is abduhu to Allah and rasuluhu to you. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, via the guidance of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you are healed from shaitan's attack at the rububiyyah and ubudiyyah. So there's 4 things basically. There's the dramatis personae, there's you and Allah. There is the relationship between the two of you, rububiyyah, ubudiyyah. There is shaitan disrupting both of those 2 things. There's the Prophet ﷺ healing both of those 2 things. And every single thing in your life, everything in your life is that. That's it. That's the whole thing. There is nothing else. There's nothing else in the whole of the religion except that. Yeah? Now, understanding that, understanding the nature of the human, the nature of the divine, the nature of what's happening in your life, the nature of your response, the nature of its corruption, the nature of its healing, that's what the Ihya is about. That is the ilm al-akhirah of Ghazali. Right? So to recognize that how he views marriage is about how Allah is doing your rububiyyah through the relationship, how you respond with ubudiyyah through that relationship, how shaitan seeks to disrupt both of them and therefore split husband and wife, cause arguments, cause hatred, cause jealousies and anger to arise and so forth, and how the Prophet ﷺ, the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ heals those things. If you understand that, then you can decontextualize from his time and recontextualize it to our time, because you are doing so on the basis of an usul. And the usul is that what Ghazali is laser focused on is your heart. And by your heart, he means your human reality, your ultimate human reality, the part of you that is meant to know God and experience God. And I say to people that you go from shahada, sorry, I'm giving a bayan now, aren't I? You go from shahada to shahada. This is the human journey. From shahada to shahada through shahada. So what do I mean? Your very, very first experience as a human being is the alast. Is the witnessing of God. Is Allah saying, Alastu bi rabbikum? Am I not your Lord? Your soul that is before you even put into a body. You're that pure soul. Right? Alastu bi rabbikum. Am I not your Rabb? The word is important. Rabb. Am I not your Rabb, the one who does your rububiyyah? Okay? And our response is Bala shahidna. So the very, very first thing you do, every single one of us, every single human that has ever lived, is do shahada. And the end of your temporal existence before you enter eternity is what? وُجُوهُ يَوْمَئِذٍ نَاظِرَةٍ إِلَى رَبِّهَا نَاظِرَةٍ. Is the beatific vision, is the shahada of God. Is the shahada of God. And how do you go from this shahada, which is your origin, to this shahada, which is your destiny? Through shahada. Through ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasul. Yeah? So what are you doing? You know you exist. You know God. You are bearing witness that there is no God but Allah. You bearing witness He is your Rabb. You are doing ibadah of Him through what? Through the Prophet, through the guidance of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So all those four things are in there. And the fact that you need to do it means that there is something that is seeking to pull you away from it, and that's the shaitan. Those are your 4 things. Again, that usul is the basis of the Ihya. That's the heart of the Ihya. It's never explicated in that way, but that's the heart of it. And when you then take something about marriage or about trade or about travel or whatever, how would you bring it from the 5th century to the 15th century? Yeah, that's the process that we've sought to apply anyway. Sorry, you want to ask about other things as well, but that's the commentary. I suppose ultimately, I'm trying to explain it to myself, but the commentary is really about bringing that forth.
Speaking of recontextualization, I've seen this a lot. Not even like not in the sense of the here, but when it comes to the Quran, like when non-Muslims, come to you and they're like, why is I don't know, Aisha radiallahu anha like 9 years old, or there's aspects of the Quran that they can't understand, and so for them, like that process that you talked about, like recontextualization, is missing because they're trying to kind of get that
So
rationale
before you're
to
right,
just.
but first you have to contextualize, and this is the thing that most of us don't do. I probably mentioned this when we did the fiqh thing as well. You need to understand that there are eternal fiqhi principles. Of course there are, but there's also a heck of a lot of what's going on in society. And you have to understand the context in which that particular author is writing. What was going on in order to understand anything about it. And look, where non-Muslims are concerned with the Quran, this. You're right. I was talking to a group of students about the Quran. We have a Quran course as well, and I was talking about the importance of how you translate words. And I used the verse of Allah, which is "Man jahada fina lanahdiyannahum subulana." So whoever does jihad in us, literal translation, whoever does jihad in us, we will open the ways for them. Right? We will open our ways for them. And I said to the students, how do you translate the word jihad in this verse? I said, you guys will all translate it as strive and struggle. Right? So the verse now, it says jihad as striving, sacred striving. So what does the verse mean? Whoever strives and struggles in our way, we will open up the ways for them. Whoever strives and struggles for our sake, we will open up our many ways to our presence for them. Beautiful. But if you're a non-Muslim and you see the word jihad, what do you translate it as? Well, holy war. So what does the verse mean? Well, it means whoever fights the holy war in the way of God, God will open the way to them. What does that mean? Well, it means grant them victory and world domination, right? So the verse now means if you do jihad, we will grant you world domination. So the entire complexion of the verse has changed because of how you understand one word. Yeah, and this is something that the other thing that occurs, and one of the things that we've done with the students doing it here is actually really we've really examined how we ourselves are influenced by our own cultural moment, by what's happening not now but over the last 100 years, and how in very insidious and pervasive ways we have a certain framework of understanding things. And to realize that there's not a problem to have that, but to know that this is only one of many such frameworks of understanding. And the Quran and the guidance of Islam actually is transcendent beyond all of them. It can be applicable in any of those contexts, but it is not bound by any of those contexts either. And that's a really important thing to understand. And the marriage of Sayyidah Aisha is a good example of that. So it only became an issue. It was not, throughout the Crusades and the Ottoman period and all that kind of stuff. This just wasn't an issue. None of the polemicists raised this as an issue. It only gets raised as an issue basically in the beginning of the 20th century. Before that, no one had an issue. Everyone knew, well, not everyone, but learned people knew that Sayyidah Aisha was very, very young. And let's be honest, right? If you start saying 18 years old, but the Prophet would have been in his 50s when he married her. Does that make it okay now? He's like, oh no, she wasn't. No, but she was 16. It's like, well, that's better. What do you think a person's going to say to you? That whole thing is actually not about. I mean, someone asked me about this the other day, and I said, how old was Mary when she gave birth to Jesus? How old was Mary? And they're like, what? I don't know. I said, Mary was 12. Mary was 12 when she gave birth to Jesus, right? Let that sink in for a minute. Yeah, and then come back to me and tell me about age. Yeah, so sometimes you need a bit of a pithy response, but it is about recognizing that our mores are not, I think Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad had this lovely statement he made once, which is that the the late 20th century cultural mores do not have a right of naskh over the Quran. I do not have the right to abrogate the Quran, basically, which is a very cool way of saying, understand that you are culture bound.
It's fascinating. I wanted to ask, in kind of like recontextualizing and kind of putting together this new commentary on the Ihya, was there any kind of moments of kind of reckoning with this the new world that we live in vis-a-vis kind of consumerism, you know, thinking about the food we eat, for instance, you made up, I think, a very fascinating point about you eat in order to have strength to worship Allah, and now, we have these kind of halal burgers, which are like, three or four different kind of, patties and cheese and so on and so forth. And it's just like, it's almost the opposite thing. You're eating and you're becoming slothful and becoming lazy and kind of, was there any kind of reckoning with this kind of new consumerist world against what Ghazali would have been kind of writing
So,
in.
so, so yes, there absolutely has been, and we spoke quite a lot actually about firstly the idea of restraint in consumption. Although we'll come to that because Ghazali has a book on hunger, which is pretty gnarly. He doesn't mess about. Ghazali's path was a path of hunger, actually, so he doesn't mess about with it. But but we have spoken about it in the Book of Eating, obviously. Which is what's interesting, actually, is that the Book of Eating is it has the adab of kind of eating itself, right? Just eating. But then most of the book is actually about eating with others. So it's actually about, and what's fascinating is that a lot of the athar of the Salaf that he mentions here are actually about kind of being extravagant, kind of, 3 courses. And he even lays out a meal plan. Like, you're inviting people over, here's your meal plan from the Quran and Sunnah. Here's your meal plan, basically. It was very interesting. But it's interesting that, there is this kind of, you can kind of wind it when you're eating in company, because the important thing is the company, actually. But we did talk about it there, obviously, obvious place to talk about it. But we also spoke about it more broadly when we were doing the Book of Trade. And we were talking about the idea of a common good economy. What is the philosophy of an Islamic economy? And it is an economy of ta'awun. It's, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى, that ultimately it is about humans coming together and building a better society. And I said, that our motto during part of that book was, if anybody loses, nobody wins, basically. And that's the idea of it, that everyone's got to win, right? If anyone loses, then no one has won. And that's that idea of, say that Omar said, if there's one old woman, if there's one old woman in by the side of a river somewhere who doesn't have enough food to eat, then, then Omar is responsible for that person. It's that sort of idea. We also spoke at a deeper level about the nature of capitalism. And I said, you must understand that the nature of capitalism only works if you are unhappy, basically, right? The whole point of capitalism is for you to be discontent with what you have. If you are content with what you have, you will not buy the next thing, right? So in order for the entire game to work, for capitalism, full stop, in order for it to work, you have to be unhappy. Yeah. And therefore everything, now the whole social media thing, it's all monetized now. It's all become about selling a product or this or that or whatever it happens to be. What is that about? It is about finding out what you have, what would be a better thing to have, and making you discontent with what you have and desiring and needing that next thing, the better phone, the faster car, the prettier wife, whatever it happens to be. It's all about that. And I said to people, if you want a cure to capitalism, be content. If you are content, capitalism has no hold over you. And capitalism is there's 2 meanings of dunya. Right? Dunya is that which drags you down, right? Which is what most of us mean by dunya, actually. What drags you down. Yeah? And dunya as thumma dana fatadalla. Dunya as the arena in which the ayat of Allah are manifest, the arena in which the qualities of God are brought near to human understanding or to human perception. Right? So there's an elevated meaning of the word dunya and a lowly meaning of the word dunya. Now, capitalism is that lowly meaning of the word dunya. Right? And when I say to people, you are promised happiness in the future. If it's an if happiness. If I get this, if I have that, if this is, then I will be happy. But when that point comes, you are happy for a day, for a season, for a year, and then there's a new thing. If I had, and there's another thing. So it's capitalism actually really brings out the nature of dunya, especially the type of hyper capitalism that we have at the moment. So we spoke a lot about that actually in book 13 of the Ihya.
In terms of when it comes to like going back to, I had to make a point about Aisha radiallahu anha and her age as well. In that context, what's fascinating, I never really understood the arbitrary sort of when people talk about like age, to me it's a bit arbitrary because like for example, my personal experience is that when I go to the villages back in Bangladesh, I'm seeing like kids that are 7, 8 years old, so matured, literally like running a whole shop on their own. You know what I mean? Like at like 8 or 9 years old. And at that age, I remember like because I have a younger sister and she's a similar age. So my cousin is also a similar age in Bangladesh, and I'm looking at the two, and it's like one's literally an adult and one's literally a child. Like it's unbelievable. Like my cousin in Bangladesh, he's like he's the one guiding me through the streets of Bangladesh, like trying to negotiate with the rickshaw drivers. He's trying to like, he's that kind of character. And then, you know what I mean? This is only in the present age. So for me, when I'm thinking like back in those days, like 9 years old would have been literally, a different like story altogether. So for me, that age kind of discussion, like, alhamdulillah, like thankfully we don't sort of, uh, get influenced by, as Muslims, like we don't just use today's day and age as a standard of morality, right? Like as you explained. So I just had to make that point, like when it
I
comes
think
to.
that's a really important point to make. And I think that's something that, remember that, I mean, you guys are kind of, you are from Australia, right? Or
Yeah, I'm from Australia and Nadim's from UK.
Oh, right. Okay. So I mean, but you still count as part of the global West, basically, even though you're in Australia. This idea of the West, yeah,
Yeah.
kind of this kind of a culture, a Eurocentric culture, effectively. We as born and raised in the West, but who have these very strong links to the not West, have an exposure to ways of living that would have been a lot closer to traditional ways of living, that actually a lot of our, a kind of indigenous, you might say, indigenous British people or what, don't have. So we actually have, a way of looking at the world, a way of living. We have access to a way of living that, the people that you're talking to often just don't have. They have existed in a monoculture their entire lives, and having had that lived experience of a 9-year-old kid running a shop. I mean, who on earth in England or in Australia is going to be okay with a 9-year-old kid running a shop? It's completely unheard of, right? But because we have that, we have this different way of understanding, or we understand there are different ways of living. Remember that a lot of the people that you're talking to don't have that. That they really do genuinely, subconsciously. I mean, intellectually they'll realize it once you explain it to them, but emotionally and subconsciously, there is only one way to live. This is why you get this idea of exporting democracy, and and it's got it's one person, one vote, and blah blah blah. It's this idea that it's the updated version of the white man's burden. Basically, there is only one way to live, our way. And that's not even necessarily a malicious thing, right? It's just that how could you live any other way than this? Now, what we have, just because we got family back home and we got this and we got that, is just we have other ways to live. I'm going to give you an even simpler example than you gave me, which is, if I were to take a chicken to my back garden, and cut its head off, and then and kind of pluck feathers off it. I mean, flipping heck, man, they'd phone MI5. You know what I mean? Because but they're having a roast chicken dinner. They're cooking a roast chicken dinner. Well, where do you think that chicken came from? Right? Why is it? What's the problem here? The problem is, and I would have thought the same thing. I used to love eating, meat and this and that and the other. And then I actually went to South Africa, which is where my family are from, and they do qurbani like in their back gardens, basically. You see the animal living, you feed the animal, you give the animal water, then you see it, or you yourself are actually sacrificing the animal. You're actually taking the life, you're slitting the throat of the animal, you're then skinning it, you're doing all these things, taking out its guts. Who knows about this stuff in Brisbane? You know what I mean? Or maybe if you've been to the outback, you've been hunting in the outback or something, but in kind of metropolitan, Brisbane or Sydney, who encounters this stuff? Yet you'll quite happily go to McDonald's and have a Big Mac, right? We've lost that connection, and therefore you get always barbaric. That's completely illogical intellectually. But people don't think intellectually until you help them to think intellectually. Most of us think emotionally. And because we've had experiences that are, like in my case, this, in your case, what you were saying, because we've had these experiences, we see these, we are able then to, it's easy to rise above the emotionalism and engage in an intellectual discussion. Where people have problems with this is when they have not had that exposure. And so they are trapped within that emotional way of thinking. This is wrong. This is cruelty. This is whatever it happens to be. That's just, and you have to recognize when you talk to people that you're trying to make a rational argument, but you're just sounding callous. You're just coming across as callous. Unless you can recognize why this person, and look, there are bad faith actors, but most people that you talk to are talking in good faith. They genuinely are horrified at the idea of killing an animal and eating it. But they are not horrified at the idea of eating an animal. Right? And it's that, and when you say, well, you do realize that the animal that you are eating came from somewhere. Its life was extinguished. Yeah? If you can talk to people in that way, I mean, this is about, kind of niceties of da'wah, I suppose you might say, if you're going to put it in a category, but it's important to recognize that we have, not through any cleverness on our part, or through any special skills, or even our Islam, we just have exposure to different experiences. And therefore, even if we don't view the world that way, even if you went to Bangladesh, you saw your 9-year-old cousin running a shop, doesn't mean when your kid's 9 years old, you're 9 years old, you're going to get to run the shop. Like, to say the Aisha thing, the question is, would you be comfortable with your daughter getting married at 9 years old? You know what I mean? And the answer, the clever answer is, if it was to the Prophet, then yes. But to anyone else, no. That's the fact of it. You wouldn't be. Right? You would be. Why wouldn't you be? And you say, I wouldn't be, but I recognize that the reason I wouldn't be is two things. Number one, I've grown up in a culture where that doesn't happen. Number two, my daughter and the person you're talking about marrying her have grown up in a culture where that doesn't happen. And so no one is prepared for this. Right? People in that culture, say that Aisha Siddiqah was already engaged when the Prophet ﷺ had the dreams. She was already going to be married to somebody. Right? Zayd, who was called Zayd ibn al-Harith, Zayd ibn Muhammad, the Prophet's adopted son, marries who? Marries Ayman. Who is Ayman? Ayman is older than the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah, and she was one of the nurses of the Prophet ﷺ. So that's the other way around. I mean, Zayd is, he's young. He's probably a teenager, maybe in his 20s. And he's marrying somebody who's probably in her 50s, maybe even her 60s. Yeah? They just didn't think about marriage in terms of age. It was simple as that. But, it's recognizing that we are bound by certain mores, but we do not, and it's fine, it's not a problem. No one is saying you have to marry someone 20 years younger than you. But what we don't do is make something, our cultural and social moment, a trans-historical good. That's the critical thing. What I believe is good and appropriate and proper must be good and appropriate and proper for every time and place of humanity. And anyone of any, of any stripe of human being at any point in history who did something that contravened this is evil and disgusting and, inverted commas, sinful. Right? Well, what you've done is you've simply not recognized that you simply inhabit one particular moment in the flow of history. And that moment has come about for all kinds of reasons. I mean, when you get to, how come there's a 9-year-old who can run a shop? Well, our 9-year-olds, I mean, my daughter's 7, for God's sake. Yeah, my youngest daughter is 7. By the time she's 9, she'll, probably have kind of got her times tables down. You know what I mean? Are you running a shop? What? You must be off your head, right? But that is because we have an education system that educates us until we are 16 to 18. And we have that educational system because, and we have that because, and something, 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 World War One, and something, 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 the Industrial Revolution, and etc., etc. You know what I mean? Otherwise, you'd be, 9-year-olds in Victorian England would be up chimneys, man, cleaning out chimneys, and no one, and all the best and brightest and most ethical people had no problem with it because they're just young adults. Anyway.
Definitely, yeah. Sheikh, in regards to also, I want to touch a little bit on the Ihya and also kind of make the discussion towards, I guess, psychology, which is also your expertise, because Ghazali's map of the heart predates modern psychology. So where does it align with contemporary clinical insight and where does it correct it?
Okay, that's a broader discussion. Ghazali has a number of approaches to the human, but as a general principle, what is a theistic psychology? Forget even an Islamic psychology. What is a theistic psychology? All right. To understand that, you've got to recognize that there are theistic forms of psychology, of which Islam is one, and then there are non-theistic forms of psychology. Every human society has had some way of understanding the nature of the human. Every human society. And whatever their way of understanding the human was their psychology. Right? Whether they call it that or not is irrelevant. Okay? But every human culture has got this. So the real question is not what does it add or what does it subtract, but rather to recognize that there are elements of human psychology that are based on experience and, you might say, empiricism. Okay? In other words, trial and error. Okay? What you see and what you observe, right? When a person, loses someone close to them, they become really sad, right? When someone is confronted with an overwhelming situation, they become really, really anxious, all right? And their anxiety manifests like this or like that or like that, like whatever, right? These are observational findings. And these things are common, pretty much to all societies. We all have some version of this. You may have heard about this thing about there are kind of 6 universal human expressions, right? So all human cultures smile to express joy or happiness, and frown to express anger, and make a kind of a screwed up face like this to express disgust, and so forth. There are about 6 kind of, these are universal. Every human culture, it's very interesting. This is how they work. But then there are certain human gestures that are, that are culturally bound. For example, if I want to agree with you in England, I will do this. But if I want to agree with you in the subcontinent, I will do this, or this, right? Now, when you say, would you like a cup of tea, and someone says yes, you go, what's going on there, right? What you're saying no and yes at the same time, right? So, what's happening there? Well, it's just two different ways of body language. So
Sorry,
there are
Sheikh,
certain
I
things.
have to quickly add, in Australia, it's the slang now. I don't know if you're aware of this.
Nah,
We say,
nah,
yeah, nah.
yeah, nah, yeah.
Yeah, nah,
Well,
as
nah,
no,
nah,
and
mate.
then, ah,
It's
yeah,
like, well, that's the
yeah.
thing. And nah means like, it's like mate, mate. It's not the word mate and how you say it. It kind of has like 5 different meanings, right? And I used to say this to people, and this is about language, but I used to say, if I said to you, you know, that teacher is wicked, yeah. Well, what would you understand if I said that teacher is wicked? You say, oh, he's horrible and he's mean and he's cruel. Well, I don't mean it because I grew up in the 80s, and wicked was like the highest praise you could possibly have, man. That teacher to be wicked, that means he's like really amazing, right? So okay, but what I'm saying is that there are elements of human experience, of human psychological experience, that are general among all human beings. Okay? And all forms of psychology will address those. Then what you have, so those are the experiences, and then you have the assumptions and presumptions. And the assumptions and presumptions are the why. Why does it happen? Okay? What's going on inside? How do you change it? Now, those things will depend on the framework you create around those experiences. So modern secular psychologies, plural, create frameworks around human experience. Okay? And Freud had a framework, ego, superego, conscious, unconscious, subconscious, and so forth. Jung had a framework, the collective unconscious, the individual unconscious, etc., etc. There are CBT. There is a framework which is that we are basically animals, and you can teach us. You teach us by exposing us to stimuli and then either rewarding us or not rewarding us, and we learn by that process of reward. That's basically what behavioral therapy is. You want to train an animal. What do? Say, good boy, sit. And the dog sits, you give it a treat. Good boy, and you give it a treat, right? The next time the dog sits, good boy, you give it a treat, right? The dog doesn't sit when you say sit, you don't give it a treat. The dog is learning behavioral therapy, right? That's behavioral conditioning. The C in CBT basically takes account of the fact that we've got a complex brain. That's it. It's just this machinery in here is a lot more complex. But we're basically animals. Which is animals with complex brains, and therefore BT is not enough. You need a C. You need CBT. Or if you're really disturbed, you need a DBT. Okay? And so that's all it is. So it is all based on a framework of how human psychology works. Islamic psychology has there is exactly the same, an assumption we make about the nature of the human being. The human in terms of the origin of the human, the nature of the human, and the purpose of the human. Okay? And this is where these psychologies differ from each other. They differ in terms of their ontology. In other words, what is the nature of the psyche that you are seeking to study? Right? What is the nature of the psyche you are seeking to ologize? Right? Or the nature of the psyche you are seeking to iatros, to treat, hence psychiatry is treating the soul. And they differ in terms of what wellness entails. And wellness relates to function and purpose, as well as to subjective experience in the moment. So I feel happy. Okay, is that a good thing? Well, it depends what's making me happy. All right, because how does that relate to my purpose? So where our religion comes, it gives us a definitive nature of the human, an origin of the human. It's what I said to you before about from shahada to shahada, right? What is the nature of the human? The human is a divine seeking missile, right? The human has been programmed. Your very base core programming, even before the programming of your DNA. Not your biological programming, which is your DNA, but your spiritual programming, which is the alast. The alast encodes you to seek God. It encodes you. That experience of God encodes you to be a seeker of the divine. Right? And what is your ultimate aim? It is to re-experience the divine. That's at wujuhu yawma idhin nadara. Okay? Or if you want, the entry into paradise. And therefore, what ultimate human flourishing is, from a Islamic perspective, is not necessarily what it is, or not exactly what it is, from a secular perspective. The way I explain this in very simple terms is I use what's called the X model. Okay? And the X model is this, that every, a secular theology has a view of what the nature of the human is, and a view of what the purpose of the human is. And an Islamic psychology has a view on what the nature of the human is, and a view on what the purpose of the human is. And you would assume, therefore, that an Islamic psychology and a secular psychology are like this. Never the twain shall meet. And what I say is, but it's not like that. It's like this. It's that. Okay? And that bit in the middle, where they cross over, that is the nature of human experience, our emotional experience of things. And that is where we can all learn from each other. Right? And that is where they cross-fertilize. I don't believe that they are completely separate. I believe that they cross over. And this is my experience. I'm 20 years, I'm 25 years I've been doing this now. Right? That crossover of the nature of human experience. Understood one way, right, from a secular perspective, because what is the nature of the human and what is the purpose of the human? And understood another way from the Islamic perspective, what is the nature of the human, what is the purpose of the human? But it's the same experience that you're having. And what you can actually then do is really bring together the nature of experience. And what a lot of the models of psychology do really is focus on the nature of the experience. And how you enrich that with the Islamic perspective is you add the rest of the arrow. You're experiencing, this is your nature, and that is why you experience this, and this is your purpose, and that is why you experience, and this is what it's taking you towards. And it's very similar to what I said to you before, which is that this is the idea that everything you experience in your life, good, bad, ugly, everything you experience in your life is decreed to happen to you. And it is therefore part of Allah's rububiyyah. And the Rabb is Rahman. Right? The Rabb is Rahman. And therefore all of it is for your growing. It is just, how is it for your growing? That's the question you have to understand. I was telling somebody the other day, they were talking about how much difficulty they had in their lives. And I said, it may well be that on the day of judgment, all the heavy experiences you've had in your life will make you an anchor that others will cling to, because you will have a strength and a resilience because of the hard experiences you've had. You will have a strength and resilience that other people like me, who've had a very easy life, will simply not have. And don't just think about what you are now. Think about what you are being made into, what you are being forged, in your case, into, through heating and hammering and plunging into cold water. Your iron is being made steel. Sorry, you were saying.
No, sorry, Sheikh, regarding Freud, for example, well-known theory of guilt is that because your id is or ego is misaligned with the superego, so the superego is like all the principles you live by, or like the societal standards or religious, teachings that you follow. If you don't follow to that level, then you experience guilt. So that's what kind of Freud talks about. And
the tension that the ego experiences because of the conflicting pulls of the id and the superego.
And that's why he sort of, I guess, indirectly or directly shuns religion in some ways, because it creates that guilt in people that for many people,
because Catholicism is basically guilt.
Yeah, and we know a lot of
speak to any Catholic person, and they will tell you, I have a lot of guilt in me because I'm Catholic. Literally, that's just the line. I have a lot of guilt in me because I'm Catholic. And Freud is growing up. Oh no, Freud was in Protestant, wasn't he? I don't know where they was. Anyway, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Now here's Freud. That exact example. I was actually asked about this in South Africa, in a radio show in South Africa recently. And I said, Freud, that whole superego ego business is the definition of close but no cigar. He almost got it, but just not quite. Because you take Freud a minute and you just look at Freud from an Islamic perspective, right? And what have you got? Okay, so the superego are the principles that you live by and blah, blah. Okay, that's Sharia. That's Sharia, right? And your id, well, that's your kind of your basic desire. Well, that's your nafs, right? And so my nafs is always getting me to, do things and commit sins and blah, 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 and the Sharia is there to say, no, you can't, right? And I'm in the middle of these two things, right? And I feel guilt. So Freud's right, isn't he? So Freud's right. He's exactly right, right? That you've got the Sharia, which is the superego. You've got the nafs, which is the id, and you're in the middle of those two things. Yeah, getting pulled in both directions, and you can't win. You just can't win, and so you just feel you're just guilty all the time. So so Freud is right. No, he's not. He's actually almost right and completely wrong. And the reason for that is what makes up the superego in Freud's understanding is societal expectations. It's not so much principles. In Freud himself, it was about societal expectations. And societal expectations were basically about conformism. You conform, you fulfill your role, and so you don't get too uppity, etc., etc. It's about, and societal expectations are set by humans. But you have an animal nature that is eros and thanatos, consume and destroy, right? Consume and destroy. Okay? And these two things can never be reconciled. There is a wild beast inside you, and society has placed a cage around it. And you are the cage. The ego is the cage. And the wild beast is hurling itself against the walls of the cage. Yeah? And you have, and maybe you're not like, you're in there with it, right? So you're one of the rats in the sack. Right? And you're just getting torn apart, which is the guilt and that kind of stuff. Islamically, that's not how this works. And the reason for that is Islamically, the superego, the thing you are being called to, is the Sharia. But what is the Sharia? The Sharia is fundamentally reducible to one principle. When you take maqasid and all that stuff, it's fundamentally reducible to one principle. And that principle is the averting of harm and the acquisition of benefit. So I've got a book somewhere here on my bookshelf, somewhere there, by Al-Iz bin Abdis Salam called Al-Qawaid Al-Kubra, the greatest principles of the religion. And he basically reformulates the whole of the Sharia on the basis of the principle that of daf'ul mafasid wa jalb al-manafi'. So what is the purpose of the Sharia? It is to avert harm and to acquire benefit. For who? For you. For you. So what is the Sharia seeking to do to help you? And what is it called when you want to avert harm from somebody or make sure they acquire a benefit that they need? That's called rahmah. Iradatul khair lil ghair. Right? The desire that good come to others. This is the definition of rahmah. Right? So what is the Sharia? The Sharia is rahmah. So the principle of the superego from the Islamic perspective is not malevolent, but benevolent. And what is the id? Well, the id is your fundamental basal human nature, which is what? It is the quwwatul shahwa and the quwwatul ghadab. It is the desire faculty and basically the fear faculty. Sometimes translated as anger faculty, but really it's the fear faculty. Right? So you desire what is beneficial, and you fear, and you are averse to what is harmful. What does the Sharia come to bring? To tell you and guide you to what is beneficial, so that you acquire what is beneficial, and you avert what is harmful. So what do? You get a perfect alignment. A perfect alignment of the fear drive and a perfect alignment of the desire drive. And that connection between the two is to recognize that Allah is the one who knows what is beneficial and what is harmful and guides you towards it. What that does is it elevates desire into its highest manifestation, which is love. And it elevates fear to its highest manifestation, which is awe. And the third faculty, which is intellect, is elevated to its highest manifestation, which is wonder. Love, awe, and wonder are the highest manifestations of the quwwatul shahwa, the quwwatul ghadab, and the quwwatul aql. Love, awe, and wonder are the components of the spiritual experience. What is worship? Worship is love, awe, and wonder. Yeah? And that is in relation to the three fundamental divine attributes, which is Jamal, Jalal, and Tanzih. Beauty, majesty, and transcendence. So the human is created with three faculties, each one a means of experiencing one of these three aspects of the divine perfection. The way in which you elevate them from lust to love, from anger to awe, or from unreasoning fear to awe, and from cunning to wonder, is via the superego. So what you have now is not the id pulling in one direction and the superego pulling in the other direction, but rather the superego lifting the ego up and aligning it perfectly to the ultimate human flourishing. So the exact same system, id, ego, superego, when understood from an Islamic perspective, is not an irreducible conflict, but rather a stairway to heaven. Yeah? So that's why when I say Freud was almost right and completely wrong. What was missing? He got it. Yes, you're right. There are these factors. They can cause guilt and all this. But what's missing? What's missing is a fundamental understanding of the nature of the human insofar as the human relates to God. That.
In other words, would it mean also using temperament terminology, the melancholic earth temperament, that idealistic sort of frame of mind? When someone has that or embodies that, they are going to do what they can in order to achieve those ideals or goals or ambitions. And in this case, it's about obviously worshipping Allah to the best that we can. Would that be a right example to give, or am I missing the mark?
So the temperament model is obviously not a Freudian thing. It's ultimately kind of an Aristotelian thing, right? And it goes even further back. It goes to Galen and so forth. And obviously the Muslims kind of picked it up and ran with it because it makes a lot of sense. I mean that model is in use even today. You go for a Myers-Briggs personality inventory test. It's basically that. You get that. What is it? NJIT or whatever those various. You get these 4-letter codes. It's basically a more sophisticated version of the temperaments.
And disc theory as well, like red, blue, green, etc. Like that's also heavily correlated with.
No idea what that is.
Yeah, there's a book called Surrounded by Idiots that's made one of the bestsellers, and it's basically talking about the disc theory, which is basically the temperament. So, like for example, I think green is melancholic. Blue I think is melancholic. Green is like phlegmatic, but it's like they don't use the terms phlegmatic or choleric, they just use red, blue, green, etc. But it's like literally describing the temperament. So
yeah, I mean those terms themselves are they mean nothing, right? What does choleric even mean? What does What does sanguine even mean? Well, these terms go back to the ancient Greek, right? So the phlegmatic is the phlegm. They were talking about the fluids that exist in the human, the phlegm. All right. The sanguine is blood, basically. The choleric is bile, right? So blood, bile, and phlegm. And then you have this fourth, very mysterious substance that was said to exist, but nobody could ever find it. Galen could never find it, but it's called the melancholy, which means the black bile, and no one could ever find it, basically. So that's what and so if they've made it red, green, blue, and or fair play, but you're right, it all comes down to the same thing. And this is what I mean when I say these are things that are kind of recognized across cultures. I mean, in the Vedas, in Ayurveda, which is the Hindu one, they have three elements: the three vyas, which are the three temperaments, basically. In Chinese medicine, I think they have five. So they have the air, earth, fire, water, and then I think it's life is the fifth one. So there are these various ways of looking at it, and all cultures have kind of recognized this, and how they, and to a lesser extent, how they relate to personality. That there are certain personality types, but remember that in the temperament theory, that the personality types actually arise from certain physical traits. So if you actually read the books on this, they will talk about somebody who is choleric, and they will describe their physiognomy. They will describe their shape. They look like this. They have ruddy cheeks. And so forth. And their temperament is like this. And someone who is phlegmatic is kind of, I forget how it was, kind of, somebody melancholic is tall and thin, and it's that sort of thing. And so they will actually talk about their physical characteristics, what type of physical diseases they are prone to, and then what type of temperament they have. Yeah, but the idea that there are different types of temperaments, and people fit into these different kind of categories, and therefore, if you understand this, you can have a way of relating to somebody. If you know someone has a choleric temperament and you have a sanguine temperament, then you can kind of learn how to relate to that person in the most positive. You can how to make friends and influence people type thing, Dale Carnegie thing from back in the 70s. It's how you can actually get on well and have a flourishing relationship with that person, basically. So I explained to somebody once, I don't know whether I mentioned this on the podcast before, about the hadith about the four khalifas, that arhamu ummati bi ummati Abu Bakr, wa ashaddahum fi amri Allahi Umar, wa astaqahum haya'an Uthman, wa aqadahum Ali. Right? And I said that this relates to four things. So there's four of them, and each description relates to one of the temperaments, basically. Yeah, but also there are four of them, and each one relates to one of the cardinal virtues. So the Aristotelian cardinal virtues are temperance, which is the median balance of the quwwat al-shahwa, the desire faculty, and that is Sayyidina Uthman. And then you have the who is astaqahum haya'an. He has haya, which is the perfection of temperance. And then you have courage, which is the median perfection of the quwwat al-ghadab, and that is Sayyidina Umar. Right? Ashaddahum fi amri Allahi Umar. That he is the strictest of them in enforcing the rules of Allah. He has no fear in enforcing the laws of the rules of Allah and so forth. That is Umar. And then the wisdom, which is the median of the quwwat al-aql, the median perfection of the quwwat al-aql, which is the aqadahum Ali. Ali is the wisest of them in judgment. And when these three come together, you have, Aristotle says that when you have temperance, courage, and wisdom, then when they come together, they form what he calls justice, right? Justice, eudikos, right? But when you read the Nicomachean Ethics, what he means by justice is actually rahmah. Right? He means rahmah. The justice means rahmah in our souls, in our soul thinking, and that is arhamu ummati bi ummati Abu Bakr. So arhamu ummati bi ummati Abu Bakr, the most merciful of my community to my community is Abu Bakr. That's rahmah. Ashadduhum fi amri Allahi Umar. The sternness of them, the most, the sternness of them in law is Umar. That's courage. Astaqahum haya and Uthman. The truest of them in their haya, in their modesty, is Uthman. That's temperance. Wa aqadahum Ali. The wisest of them in judgment is Ali, and that's wisdom. So, justice or mercy, courage, wisdom, and temperance. The four Khalifas. Yeah, and the same applies. Each one represents the archetype of a particular temperament. Yeah, so it's very interesting. It's a very interesting theory, but it's one of those things that, as I say, in the broad scope of what you're talking about, what is the human, as any culture has understood it, they all have this kind of notion of temperaments, and that people are different, and kind of what we would say genetically different from each other.
What would your response be, Sheikh? Like, people hear about in this day and age, especially, and this kind of actually goes back to our conversation around societal standards, norms that we are accustomed to, and making judgments about the past as a result of just adhering to the standards of today. Like, a lot of people will be like, when they hear about temperaments and then they hear about black bile phlegm, they're like, oh, this sounds silly. We have modern medicine, we have science. Like, what is this backwards way of thinking? And the science doesn't, it sounds strange. Like you mentioned, the black bile isn't really necessarily observed, so therefore how can it sort of exist? I mean, you can make that argument with Allah, astaghfirullah, like, we're not going to do that, right? But anyways, that's a side
You
point.
don't
But
even go that far. Your mind is not detectable on any scan. Your brain is, but your mind cannot be detected. Your mind is not, no mental illness, with the exception of dementia, pretty much. No mental illness has any biomarker. Lots of neurological, like functional neurological illnesses, have no biomarkers. You cannot detect them. If you say, I've got a splitting headache, and I do every test under the sun, functional MRI scans, scans of your cerebral blood flow, blah, 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 I will not pick up anything. There are certain ones I will, obviously, but normal, ordinary, boring tension headache, I will not pick up anything. There is not a single empirical marker that you have a headache. Does that mean you don't have a headache? Modern medicine also has things that are undetectable, but the mechanism is presumed. It has to be there to explain these set of symptoms. We just don't know how. And so
that's really,
the thing that generally, medicine, modern medicine is, I've got a whole very lengthy book chapter where I go into really nerdy detail about this, but modern medicine is a science of reduction. Right? It ultimately comes from microscopes. That's the real step change that differentiates modern medicine from traditional medicine is microscopes. You can look further into the human than you could before, and you can detect pathology at a cellular tissue level. Okay, what you tend to lose in modern medicine, and I say this as a doctor, what you tend to lose in modern medicine is a view of the whole. It's a bit like if you zoom into one part of a picture, yeah, you may very well see the brush strokes of the artist, the individual brush strokes of the artist in the picture, but you will lose the perspective of the whole picture. It's a bit like having one piece of the jigsaw. But we've got modern medicine basically is a whole lot of jigsaw pieces. It's such small jigsaw pieces that we could never have imagined before, right? But what you do when you are playing with your jigsaw pieces, it's really great to have them because you can put them together and you can, figure out that this links to that and that links to that and this bit goes there, that bit goes there. It's brilliant. But sometimes you lose the ability to take a step back and look at the whole picture. Now, traditional medicines basically try to look at the whole human. That's why they're called holistic. Now, which is better? They both have their benefits. That's just the fact, but they both have their benefits. the thing to remember, that more broadly about what you said, is that people look at people in the past and say, oh, they were stupid. You know things that they didn't know. Agreed. Right? But they weren't stupid. Human intelligence has not evolved, and it certainly has not evolved over the last 1400 years. Right? We are no more intelligent. We have no more brain power or processing power than people had 1400, 2000, 10,000 years ago. Right? We simply have benefited from an accumulation of knowledge of humanity over centuries and millennia, right? And have tools by which we can bring that together in particular ways that maybe were not accessible to other people. Agreed. What that and the information age is, if it's taught us anything, it's taught us that there is such a thing as too much information. When you have too much information, you select. You select certain, and what determines which bits of information you select and which bits you leave out, that's not about this, that's about this, and more likely about down here, actually. Right? We are still, that id you were talking about, it's still there. That hasn't changed. Right? Our emotional nature hasn't changed. Our intellectual nature hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is we have gone from a lake's worth of information to an ocean's worth of information. But here's the thing, no fish can traverse the entire ocean.
Yeah,
You
definitely. And
only swim in you only experience a certain portion of the ocean.
it's also speaking to the conversation with earlier Sheikh about I feel like at the core of it, it's sincerity, where that process of decontextualization, recontextualization, it also kind of can be applied in this context where if we're using knowledge from the past, it's about kind of understanding, like in the case of temperament theory, any other science as well. And even what's interesting, like speaking of, like, I have so many personal stories, like in terms of many people that, like you talked about, doing x-rays and scans and nothing showing up, but they know something's wrong, like they know there's a problem. And there's that shift away now, I'd say, to a lot of people going to, like, I would say naturopaths or Islamic doctors, of that kind of traditional sense. And even for me, like I see a Chinese doctor pretty regularly, actually, like they specialize in acupuncture as well. I've been trying to get them on the show. That's another story for another time. They're a little shy, but and you see that shift. Like, what's interesting is that, like, the first thing in Chinese medicine when they try to diagnose the patient is, like, they look at the tongue. And that's very foreign concept to what we live in today's day and age. No doctor, other than from maybe checking if you have like a cold or a sickness with the whole stick they use. Other than that, they don't actually look at the color of your
I was going to say, the first thing they teach you in med school is to say ah.
tongue. But yeah, like, it's really fascinating. And obviously the understanding of, like, the chi flow that contributes to the color of your tongue is really important. That goes into, like, personality types and diet, and from just looking at your tongue, which is all very profound if you think about it, as opposed to what we're used to in the day and age of modern
Yeah.
medicine. So I think there's a big shift away. So I just want to get your thoughts on that as well. Yeah, from your
Look, at the end of the day, um, all of these systems are systems of understanding human physiology. And human physiology is more complex than all of those things, right? As I mentioned to somebody else in a different context, that they are all glorious failures, right, to understand the human, all right? At the end of the day, if it works for you, then go for it. Simple as that. If it works for you, then you go for it. The only be wary of anyone who makes big promises, right? Generally speaking, be wary of anyone who makes big promises, and be wary of anyone who's got something to sell you, right? Who has a stake in your illness. Ghazali actually mentions, he talks about doctors, and he said, be wary if you're going to become a doctor, because your livelihood depends on people being ill. So at the very least, you might find yourself making dua that people become ill so that they can come to you for treatment. Yeah. So, be wary of this type of thing. I work for the NHS, so I don't have this problem. I get paid my salary, whether my clinic is full or empty. Yeah. Yeah. So be wary of that. One of the things I think that the modern approach does, which is helpful, is there are mechanisms of quality assurance. Okay. So I remember I have one of my friends, he lives in Birmingham, fairly close to me. He's a Maliki, he's a Pakistani Maliki Mufti from Birmingham, which is a very, very odd, strange thing. If I mention his name, people might know it, but I won't. And I said to him, I said to him once, I said, I have a nickname for you. He said, what? He said, it's Unchained Maliki. And he said, what? He said, Unchained Maliki. So he started laughing because he immediately got the song reference, right? He said, why? And I said, because look, I'm a Hanafi in Birmingham. I can give a fatwa, I can give a legal ruling, a particular, say what my understanding of Islamic law is, and there will be 6, 7, 10, 15 other Hanafis, ready to slap me down and say, you've read the book wrong, you haven't understood it properly, etc. I'm very grateful for that, because it means there is some quality control around me, right? That if I get something wrong, someone else just down the road will say, no, and it'll come to me and say, look, have you read this book? I know you read this, but there's this book that says this book that, etc., etc. I said, look at you. You're a Maliki. Which are the other Maliki scholars in Birmingham? Which are the other Maliki scholars around here? Who provides your quality control? Right? And when you don't have that quality control, if everyone around you knows less than you, right, then you're really kind of cruising for a bruising at this point, to use the English word. You're heading for a fall. Okay. Now, quality control is very important. Okay. Now, can that lead to the formation of orthodoxies that are difficult to challenge? Yes. Okay. Vaccines are a good example. People, virtually every doctor on the planet will say vaccines. You should have vaccines, and those who disagree with vaccines will say, but that's because there's an orthodoxy, right? That's because that's the hukum, and you can't transgress it, basically, right? But you have to interpret. You have to interrogate the hukum, but it's difficult to do because the orthodoxy say, no, you can't. Okay. But at least there is some quality assurance, right? Now, what happens in a lot of the alternative health or holistic health fields is that there isn't that quality assurance. If one naturopath or reflexologist or hakim says X to you, how do you check that? Right? How do you say, I want to interrogate your evidence? I want to know how you know that. I want, who has, given you, who make sure you're keeping up with your knowledge and so forth. As a psychiatrist, I have appraisals every year. I have to show that I have attended 50 hours of, courses or learning and stuff, that I'm keeping up with, the advances in my field. I have a college. So in England, we have colleges, right? The Royal College of, and it's not the Royal College of Psychiatry. It's the Royal College of Psychiatrists. It's not the Royal College of Surgery. It's the Royal College of Surgeons. Why? Because a college is a group of similarly trained professionals that self-regulate one another's practice. Right? So your regulation, is this the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? Is this the right treatment or the wrong treatment? There is this quality assurance that is there. Okay? Now, in a lot of the alternative health fields, also in terms of ruqya, this also applies with ruqya, right? Who's your quality control? Where is everyone needs this. You can make mistakes. Who's your quality control? And that is one very significant difference between modern medicine and, inverted commas, traditional medicine. certainly in the West, where there are very, very few, relatively speaking, there are very few practitioners of alternative medicines, right? Now, if you go to China, your therapist, your Chinese medicine practitioner from, in China, it'll be exactly the same thing. There'll be a huge body. They'll probably self-regulate in some way. They'll probably know who's a good and who's a bad and that kind of stuff. But in Australia, how do you check that? And that's a problem because humans make mistakes.
Definitely. And Sheikh, I know we've had you in for some time. I'll ask one last question, inshallah, before we wrap up. Unless Nadeem wanted to ask
My tea is
something.
almost finished. When my tea finishes, the chat finishes.
So, speaking of, we talked about sort of temperaments and Greek influence. You talked about the virtues, the four chief virtues, all that. And there's this process where it's like, okay, we have Islam, we have our tradition. We also use, people talk about, concepts within or the categories made within even Islamic spirituality or Sufism, Nafs al-Amara, for example. Like these terminologies and these categories are probably, I guess, codified, I would say, like post the Prophet. Some, like, I don't know if they specifically used this sort of terminology at the time, perhaps, going, and this can be extended to the whole discussion on madhabs. Like, it's for us to allow us to, make our deen easier to follow, understand, and therefore we have to make these categories post the time of the Prophet. By in saying that, it's not like our tradition is in a bubble, right? And this is something we discussed in our previous episode with Shaykh Dr Asim, where he was saying, like, how much we are influenced by other traditions and how that's also shaped, and we sort of do that synthesis process, right? So in the case of, it could be even Islamic medicine, definitely, like, of course, people say Greek medicine was a big influence on Islamic medicine.
I mean, it's literally called Unani Tib. I mean, literally, it's called Unani Tib. Unani Tib literally means Greek medicine.
Yeah. And
this is, I mean, I have spoken elsewhere about the nature. I know what you mean. I know what you're saying. It's about frameworks of understanding and how Islam is, was, and should be impacted by frameworks of understanding that are inverted commas foreign.
And to what extent has that, like, outside quote unquote influences shaped Islam, and to what extent has it been done? Because it would have been, people talk about theology even being discussed in Ashari Aqidah, being influenced in that sense in order to explain aspects about theology even. So I would like to hear, like, to what extent has quote unquote outside influences shaped our deen, and should we embrace that wholesale, and have we even been doing that process even in today's day and age, where maybe we're trying to because in that, I don't know, people talk about the attack from liberalism, for example. Even sometimes I don't know what that means, but they'll talk about that, and so everyone's in that protective mode, like trying to protect the deen, protect this, but then they're sort of maybe not emulating the processes of the past of our predecessors and our scholars.
That's a big question. And I'm sure Shaykh Yasser would have given a very good response to it if it's the same question you asked him. What I would say is that, I mean, I remember a conversation I had with Shaykh Yasser. Actually, I'm sure he won't mind me saying it. And he had asked me, let me lead in with this. So he had asked me, do you really think that the Sahaba, understood, things in terms of Johar and Arad? The particles and accidents and that kind of stuff. I said, no, of course not. Of course I don't think so. Yeah. So he said, because we were talking about this. And I said, yeah. I said, no, I very much doubt that was the case, because these are philosophical concepts, not even just Greek philosophical concepts. These are one particular variation of Greek philosophical concepts, which I'll come on to in a second, what I mean by that. I said, from my understanding and how I look at this, is that the beauty of our scripture, the Quran just in and of itself, and the Hadith, because of the frameworks we have around the Hadith, transcend human epistemological frameworks. What I mean by that is humans always have a way of or human epistemological and cosmological frameworks. So humans always have a way of understanding the world around them. They have a way of what is knowledge, what is not knowledge, how do I acquire it, and so forth. And these are culture bound, they are historical, and they are often quite specific. It is the nature of the revelation that the revelation transcends all of those frameworks and can be understood, therefore, within each of those frameworks. Now, the way in which it is understood may be different, and there may be some frameworks that are more compatible with the scripture than others. Okay? But these things have always existed and will always exist. There is no geological theory in the Quran. The Quran does not specify a cosmological, whether the universe is geocentric or heliocentric, right? You simply do not have these things in the Quran. There is no framework of medicine that the Prophet ﷺ provides us. This is this idea of prophetic medicine. The Prophet does not provide. The Islam does not, let me rephrase. Revelation does not provide a framework of understanding anatomy, physiology, health, sickness, and so forth, right? Rather, and this is actually one of the great beauties of the religion, that it does not do so. It does not, for example, lay out a chronology of human history. What the big problem that the Bible has, so for Jews and Christians, the big problem is that there is a full-on chronology laid out. That's where you get, this idea that people saying the world was created in 4004 BC. Because if you follow the chronology laid out in the Bible, that is just what you get to. Yeah, Islam does not do that. Someone asked me once, so who do you think Dhul Qarnayn was? And I said, oh, that's easy. I said, who? I said, Ashoka. Ashoka, the emperor of India in the 3rd century AD, 3rd century BC. He traveled to the east, he traveled to the west, traveled to the north. He brought justice, he brought this. It's Ashoka. No. It's like Alexander and Cyrus the Great. I said, no. It's the first Chinese emperor. That's who it is. It's the first Chinese emperor. What? I said, yeah, he traveled to the east, he traveled to the west, he traveled to the north, and he subdued the barbarians, he built the wall. And what are you talking about, man? I said, this is the point. The point is, Dhul Qarnayn is not identified as a historical person deliberately, so that the religion is not constrained by a framework of understanding, by a historical framework of understanding. Okay? And that's a very good example, right, of how this works. So Islam is not, the scripture, I should say, is not constrained in this manner, and therefore it is eternal. And therefore it is, to a certain extent, mutable and can fit in with different cosmological frameworks, biological frameworks, epistemological frameworks, and so forth. Therefore, you can bring framework, you can come to Islam with a framework as long as you recognize that your framework is a human framework and the divine cannot be captured by the human. It can be perceived, the divine can be perceived through the human framework, but لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار. And this is basically one of the ways of understanding this amazing verse of the Quran. لا تدركه الأبصار. He cannot be encompassed by human frameworks, cosmological, cosmological, epistemological frameworks, but rather he encompasses all of those frameworks. Okay? So, historically, yes, absolutely, you can see elements of the Justinian Codex or, ways of, Byzantine law being adopted in fiqh, or, not in terms of the rulings, but in terms of the mechanisms. Okay? Why do the jurists, for example, use qiyas specifically? There are many ways of engaging in legal analogy and reasoning. Why qiyas specifically? Right? Is the one that is chosen. Theologically, there are all sorts of frame. I mean, and this is where theologically is very interesting, because the idea that there is an indivisible, theology is based on a cosmological basis, that there is an indivisible particle, right? In other words, the universe is finite, right? The universe is finite in division. You can divide and divide and divide until you can't divide any further. And and because there is a particle that cannot be divided any further, the universe is made up of finite particles, and therefore the universe is finite, right? That is a Greek notion, but specifically it is atomism. And it was brought about by somebody called Democritus. Now, Democritus was arguing against another Greek philosopher called Parmenides. And Parmenides had a different argument, which is the infinity of the universe, and so which weirdly sounds a bit like Ibn Arabi's Wahdatul Wujud, actually, which is very interesting. It's a topic for another day. But the point is, when the Muslim scholars now are viewing all of these things, well, this is actually we don't have our own indigenous way of looking at the world. So there are these very, very clever people that have come up with these opposing, mind you, frameworks for looking at the world. And the theologians said this framework is more applicable and is more useful, and the scripture and the revelation fits better with this framework than that framework. So they take this framework, they leave that framework out. Right? So that applies there. That you can argue the same thing for medicine, you can argue the same thing for all the other sciences as well. So yes, we absolutely do have those things. Islam does not exist in a bubble. This is very hard for people who, sometimes for people who are studying, sometimes even scholars, to understand that there is a human, a historical, a time-bound, an element of culture that exists within these sciences of Islam, right? But the more you study it, the more you realize that it is, that not only is it obvious, but our scholars were not shy about saying so. What they had was two things. Number one is they had an absolute trust, an implicit trust in the Prophet ﷺ, basically. Right? That's what it comes down to. Quran comes to the Prophet. They had an implicit trust that what the Prophet ﷺ comes with is beyond human frameworks of knowledge. That's the first thing. The second thing is they had that absolute trust in their historical moment where they are the superior culture. They are the culture in power, the civilization in power, not in a majority, but in power. That supreme confidence that provides means that we can take in these frameworks, assess them, and to argue amongst ourselves about them and determine which of those is appropriate to, or which elements of what are appropriate to bring in and make part of our own. And then for us to enrich them, add to them, and then send forth to others. And that has happened throughout Islamic history. The issue we have today is that, number one, we exist in a monoculture, a hegemonic monoculture. There is only one way of looking at human nature, physical nature, theological realities, and so there is only one way of doing it. There is an absolute orthodoxy, and this applies at all times, all places, and so forth. Right? The monoculture only seems that way because it is hegemonic. And when you have a culture that has hegemony over all other cultures to the point of what you might call epistemicide, and I think this was a term coined by, I heard it from Joseph Lombard, Professor Joseph Lombard, and he coined this term, a beautiful term, epistemicide, the systematic destruction of alternative models of knowledge. Right? When you have a powerful culture engaging in epistemicide, systematically wiping out other ways of acquiring knowledge, of viewing the nature of the human, the nature of the cosmos, and so forth, the culture is no longer viewed as a culture. It is viewed as theology, it is viewed as morality, it is viewed as economy, it is viewed as everything. And if you want to talk to misquote Francis Fukuyama and talk about the end of history, the end of history is apocalypse. This is when people say we've reached the end of history. History ends with apocalypse, man. What are you talking about? And it ends with this idea that there is nothing but what this group of people say. That is an eternal truth. Culture has now become scripture. And we need to realize that culture is valuable, it is beneficial, it provides new ways of looking at the world, understanding our scripture, interpreting our religion and our understanding of it and so forth. But it is not revelation. It is simply one other way of looking at it. Yeah, if we can keep that in mind and remember that لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار, that revelation cannot be encompassed by any human form of intellectual endeavor, but every form of human intellectual endeavor potentially has a potential to help us understand the revelation, a new facet of the revelation, a little bit better. Hence, كل يوم هو في شأن. Although لا تدركه الأبصار, كل يوم هو في شأن. Although he cannot be reached by human endeavor, but in every cultural, historical, civilizational, epistemological moment, a new facet of his beauty is revealed. If you can keep that in mind, then we can do what our ancestors did.
Thank you so much for your time, Sheikh. I know you've been so generous with your time, and I would love to. I don't know. I know you've got better things to do, but inshallah, one day if I come UK, you can do a long podcast for 5 hours, like Joe Rogan style or something. I don't know, because there's so much to talk about. So much, like we didn't even touch like a quarter of the episode. We want to talk about halaj and stuff, but that's a bit out of the question at this point. But there's so much to
Don't get me started on mystical experience here. That's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about. Inshallah, who knows in the future. But thank you so much for your time. I don't know if you had any questions you want to sort of ask to wrap up, Nadeem, before I give.
No, yeah, just shukran for a very enlightening discussion actually on spirituality and psychology. Yeah, I was enjoying that. It's a shame we has to end.
Alhamdulillah. And yeah, Sheikh, I don't know if you had any final thoughts before we wrap up, inshallah, before I do my closing thoughts.
Oh, I think people will be tired of hearing my voice by now. Spirituality is not another facet of Islam. Or it's not a foreign accretion, obviously. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it's also not just a discipline that is studied. Spirituality is the spirit of the religion. It is the breath in the body. And it infuses, and I don't mean here Sufism per se. Sufism is one manifestation of the ruh of the religion, right? But that the religion has a ruh and a jasad, and that the ruh and the jasad need to be together for the religion to be living. Yeah, this is something that we should all understand, no matter whether you are Sufi, Salafi, Deobandi, Brelvi, Sunni, Shia, whatever you like, right? But understand that the religion has a ruh, just like you have a ruh, that is both invisible and essential, without which it is a corpse and you are a corpse. That is what is really critical to understand.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your time, Sheikh.
I'm sorry. Although that spirit requires a body in which to subsist. Otherwise, religion is a ghost and you are a ghost. So don't be a ghost. Don't be a corpse. Right? Be a human. And don't let your religion be a ghost on the wind. Don't let it be a corpse on the ground. Let it be living within you. Bring the two together.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Sheikh, for all those thoughts and reflections. A lot to think about. Inshallah, perhaps in the future we can connect and do another one on different topics, inshallah. So I'll wrap it up there. So thank you to our sponsors, Human Appeal Australia. So I'll send all the links in the show notes if people wanted to donate and check out their projects when it comes to Gaza and helping people that are struggling in Gaza currently and then they're bringing in all the food and water. So check out their projects, inshallah. So from our special guest, Shaykh Dr Asim Yusuf, we wish you all the best. This is Nadeem and I signing off. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.